Thank you all so much. While we're waiting on the other panelists to be elevated to the screen, um, I just want to make a note that this piece was possible because of the lives of some young folks that I really love and cherish and care about. So these are they're based on their real stories. And myself and one of the other panelists, who was actually a part of this cohort of students, we've lost two students in the past 2 years. So before we begin our panel discussion, we are going to take 2 moments of silence, one 19 seconds and then the other 31 seconds to honor their lives. And then we'll proceed with the rest of the program. So our lovely manager, Bree, is going to help us count down the 19 seconds and then the 31 seconds. So this is the 19 seconds for initials DA. Thank you. And that was for DA. And now we're going to take 31 seconds for AL. Thank you, Bree. And that was for AL again, and that's just to honor the dates of their passing. Um, right now, I'm gonna kick it off to Diane, who's gonna introduce herself, then I introduce myself, and then the other panelists will introduce themselves, and then we will head on into the discussion portion.
Hi, I'm Diane Hill, and I directed Morgan in this wonderful piece. And before we move on, I just want to remind the audience that there is a Q&A part that you can actually type in some questions, and I'll be monitoring those. So some of you are chatting. If you can put your questions into the Q&A, then it'll be easier for me to find your questions. Thank you. And next.
My name is Morgan Breon. As you all saw, I'm a playwright, actor, and also social worker who has worked in the education realm for quite some time.
1 second. I think maybe I have to ask them to unmute,
Oh, okay.
like formally.
Okay.
Are you both able to unmute yourselves?
Yeah.
Great.
We'll pass it on to Marna.
Good evening. I am Marna Connie Robinson. I am a clinical social worker as well as a librarian at the University of Michigan. And thank you for having me on this panel. This is great.
Thank you, Marna.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Matt Mangan. I am a school leadership coach. So what I do is basically coach principals and chief academic officers on instructional equity. But I am housed here in Detroit. So super grateful to be in the space with everybody tonight and excited for the conversation.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm going to kick off the questions myself. Morgan, I was wondering if you could tell us about your journey for writing this play.
Awesome. So this has been a 4-year journey. Nice little note. Matt Mangan was actually the principal at the school that this was based on. Some characters are loosely based on him, and so 4 years ago, when I found out that the students were calling me a witch, I just was fascinated by that and everything that went into that. So tried for several years to try to get something to paper. I don't know if Diane remembers, we met at
yeah.
a Thai food restaurant place in Novi. And she was like, yeah, this is great. Just send me some vignettes. And I just couldn't get it together. So last year I had written a book, and Diane attended the Zoom launch, and she said, Morgan, do you think you can write a one-person show? And I'm like, I don't think so. She's like, so when you do, I need you to turn it in like 2 weeks. I'm like, Diane, no, I don't have anything. And she's just like, yeah, yeah, you do. And so during that time, just created this outline for the whole show, the whole play, based on a lot of different stories. And then uh, I say God, really, in 2 days, we kind of got 30 pages of script. Sent it to some people. Matt was one of them, because I really wanted to make sure that I was honoring the students and wasn't mocking them. I sent it to one of my students who may or may not be on this call. And once I got her approval, I was all set, you know. Then we took it down to 14 pages, and then uh, here we are
The
today.
rest is history. Are all of the stories real, based on real people, real
They are
events?
based on real events. I took some
Hmm.
creative liberties, mostly to kind of protect the stories of the students, but a lot of creative liberties, even though many of the events that took place were very similar.
Well, and I know when we were working on it, and I was making you cut it down, we put
Merged.
some characters, merge some characters, yes, and that was a very interesting process too, I think. So,
Yeah.
what are your hopes and goals for this play moving forward?
My hope, and Marna and Matt both know this. They're going to be a part of this. They just found out just now. Um, is to really put this piece and curriculum in front of future practitioners, either in the mental health profession or the education realm, or other individuals, eventually students, to kind of help start the conversation around trauma, generational trauma, historical racism, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll have a little poster to show you all a little bit later that kind of supplements that work, but really just to use the work as a means of conversation.
Great. So, why don't you take a moment to ask your panelists some questions?
All right. Welcome. Hello. So I'm going to ask you both kind of the same question, but just from your expertise. And then we're going to open it up to all of our audience members to ask their questions. And then we'll wrap it up with some kind of heavy hitter questions based off of the work and the work that you all do, to kind of lead us out of this evening. So, Marna, I'm going to start with you. And would you please tell us how the work that you do as a therapist, social worker, and librarian align with the themes in this play? And you can also elevate the themes that stand out for you in the play.
Um, basically, I mean, the play was amazing, awesome. And trust, hope were two of the big things that really stood out to me. And as a librarian, we do a lot of outreach. The unit that I'm with, which is Access Services, providing access to our collection to community members, students, faculty all over the state of Michigan, is reaching out and connecting with young people to let them know that there are careers that they can explore. I help them with transitioning to college. They come in, some of them have never been in a library, and showing them that education and books. And what I have done as a therapist, I specialize in eating disorders, identity issues, as well as trauma. I use my background as a librarian to do what I call bibliotherapy. And it is using books in a therapeutic setting, helping use selected books to cope with emotional problems, mental illness, helping them achieve growth, as well as insight into their own personal problems through characters in a book. And it is a very transforming experience for both the clinician and the person that I'm working with. It's a very healing process to watch someone deal with a lot of, let's say, trauma, because that's another theme that is woven through the threads of this play, is looking at that trauma and understanding that there is hope, that the trauma doesn't have to define them. And it's a lot of the work that I've done, especially after everything that's been going on in this country and the world with the pandemic and all the protests. And it's something that I love to do. So, yeah.
Thank you, Marta. And what's really important about what Marta just mentioned about the bibliotherapy is that this is kind of some of the same work that was used in working with the students, right? So like you saw Andre had to draw a house, a tree, and a person. It's using these creative methods so that way we're not just bombarding them with having to answer questions about trauma. And so they can kind of step outside of themselves and look at a character in a book, and then they can, or with the help of a clinician, kind of translate that into their own experiences. So, Matt, kind of the same question. Could you tell us how the work that you do as an educator, administrator, and director of instructional support align with the themes in this play? And feel free to elevate any of the themes that stuck out for you as well.
So I work in a space where I'm supporting mostly schools in Black and Brown communities. In doing that, the ability to analyze how race, power, privilege, and systemic oppression affects students now, their families, and historically, in education and otherwise, will always be a part of the job. So regardless if that is like named outwardly, that is where I believe my work intersects at all times. So one, watching the plays like a blast for the past for me. So I think I didn't introduce myself as the principal there because I was like, I don't know if I should. But no, I appreciate it, Morgan. I think for how those stories, one thing to know is like every student's identity is nuanced and different, and their interactions with finding hope and trauma are also different. And I think that's what this has named for me, because as I post being the principal of that school, I've worked in jobs where I'm getting a little bit further and further away from seeing students every day. And it's just a helpful reminder in terms of like what I'm fighting for in certain ways, and also the number of schools that I do support that the students there are often nameless to me because I don't know them through the lines of distance that I have. But I do believe firmly and unapologetically that supporting schools, education should be places of restoration and healing, first and foremost. And a school's ability to provide that to children and their families will help out everything else that they're trying to do, versus the other way around of doing things in a backwards orientation. And I think that was a large part why we were able to do some things at the school that Morgan and I served, and why we may have failed in certain ways and other ways of not necessarily having the breakthroughs and restoration and healing with individualized students or pockets of them. But it's something that I hold near and dear to me, and I strive to cultivate and maintain whatever professional space I enter.
So, Morgan, there are a couple questions from the audience for you, and then maybe Marna and Matt could ask you a few. These are some quick ones.
Okay.
Did you ever do forensics when you were in high school?
Yes, I was third in the state in
Oh,
2006.
well, congratulations on that.
It was because of a timing technical thing. I was first place for every competition leading up to that. Just putting that. I'm still a little bitter. Sorry.
Poor Morgan. How many characters did you portray this evening? Pat says she lost track.
I think it's about 6 to 8. I think there's 6 to 8.
I feel like it's more than that.
I think so.
Yeah.
I officially counted. Andre, Miss Morgan, Mr. Thompson,
Mrs. London, Jeremiah, Brianna, we're already at 6 there.
Yeah,
David.
David.
Yeah,
And
we're probably 9 to 10. Yeah.
yep, 8.
And another question is, will you ever have students play the parts before their peers?
I would love that one day, as long as we could house it in a way that would be harmless, not harmful, and wouldn't traumatize the students who were embodying the characters. And as long as we had the right support insulated around it, then absolutely, absolutely.
And here's a fun one for both of us, actually. What was your favorite part in the play, Morgan, to play? I think the question means what was your favorite role that you were playing?
Oh,
Yeah.
I like Brianna.
Yeah, and I'm laughing because originally it was David, right?
Yeah, it was David originally.
I always liked Brianna a lot too. I like them all. So, um, so
And if
perhaps our panelists can.
for Marna or Matt too, feel free to
Yes.
elevate it. But I also have some questions to kind of ask them about the work of the
All
play.
right. So who's going to start here?
So Marna, I just wanted to ask, so one of the key points that I wanted to elevate was the amount of trauma that the students face on a consistent basis, and to foster empathy with them. So I don't think that most people could actually endure one day of what these students experience day in, day out. I just wanted to, tell us what the impact of consistent trauma can have on a young person, and is it at all similar to PTSD? What we hear about.
Very good question. It is similar to PTSD. Those who have experienced trauma often have a difficulty identifying, expressing, and managing their emotions. And sometimes they have limited language to be able to express in verbal form what they are experiencing and what they're feeling. And a lot of times it comes out as anger, a lot of anger, a lot of hurt. They internalize, sometimes externalize stress reactions. Anger, anxiety, depression can carry with them through adulthood. And it also creates, this inability to control their emotions sometimes. And I think that came through in the piece that you just portrayed, where it is just like anger, 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 and they can't control it. Dysregulation. They become heightened, hypervigilant is a big thing. And that's a lot of what a lot of people that I work with who have experiences PTSD following a car accident, being assaulted, people who have been in, tours of duty internationally and seeing gunfight. It is the same feelings. And it is very hard, especially I think for anyone, but for young people, when they're going home, coming to school, trying to learn, trying to read, trying to concentrate, when that is in the background and it's just like a movie running over and over when they've got this trauma. And it is extremely difficult and can impact them, which is why I do the work that I do. And I love to do the work that I do because I'm helping move from here to here where they can function and not have that, like I said, define who they are.
So a few more questions have come in from our audience. Matt, you might answer this one. Do you think this play can be used to bridge gaps and disparities between educators and inner city students? And if so, how?
I think so. I think it opens a conversation, which is really important. I do think whenever showcasing things of this nature, when dealing with trauma, especially with schools and students that might feel directly like this is a mirror to them in certain ways, I think the long-term trajectory of how this could be supported in a school needs to be thoughtful and identified before you start the play. I think that's often a mistake that schools and districts might do, is like, jump right in both feet and not know what to do with what happens afterwards. I think a way to do that is to have a school that is either already in the middle of their journey of using restorative work in the school, restorative practices, restorative justice, and using this as a part of their circles that they use, as a part of reflection and thinking about what they feel when they watch it and how that might reflect experiences that they've had and those that they know and close to them. But I also think in terms of narrowing that gap, showcasing things, plays like this, can be a teaching moment, but it needs to be approached that way, versus how a lot of some plays make it into schools, and that's to fill time. And I think in order to really see the fruits of the labor of the work and also what it could do for students, especially of not having like another vector of trauma for them, is to think very critically about how to use this experience as a source of healing for students versus just a reflection of maybe something that they see day to day, which I think, and Morgan has heard me say this before, is like a lot of our students would define their trauma as the day of the week, right? Because that's what they face every Tuesday. So I think about how to work on that as a school is to be very thoughtful and intentional about how you're portraying this to students and what teachers should do with it afterwards.
Thank you. A question for Marna also. I'm sorry, Morgan, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and this is kind of what I was touching on earlier. There's a reason that my focus for now is educators and professionals, because I feel like before we give this to students, we need to make sure that the environments or the people that are where they're supposed to land, have had access to the conversations first and foremost. And I don't even know if when we take it into a school or we put it in front of students, if we will focus so much on the trauma experiences as much as using it as a mirror, but also embedding that with other elements of like, where do you go from this? So one of the biggest goals is to foster empathy, because when we see kids in the media or in other spaces that mirror the students that are talked about in this play, there's a certain level of attitude or a certain perspective around them. And again, like, you don't understand what these kids go through. You couldn't understand. And I just feel like that just needs to be honored. And I feel like we can't effectively advocate for them or support them if we don't really have an understanding about what their experiences are.
Marna, when using books to work with people, how do you go about choosing the right kind of story? And are you using different genres?
It is, as I've explained it, and I've done some trainings on teaching other clinicians to do bibliotherapy. It's kind of like there's a scene in the Harry Potter movie where Harry goes and gets his wand. And the wand kind of chooses the wizard and so forth. It is knowing the person who comes into your office, understanding where they're coming from, what they're dealing with, and choosing the right book. Because there are some books you should never use in a therapeutic setting because it may traumatize people more. And that's where my background as a librarian comes in, learning how to choose these books, understanding what book will work. And I use different genres. For example, most of the books that I use are young adult novels and graphic medicine, which is basically graphic novels based on medical or mental health issues. I read a lot, and that's how you choose the book. You have to read the book. And I have a whole database that I have compiled of all of these books that work well with some mental health issues, trauma. One book, for example, that I used this summer was a book, it's a young adult novel called Ghost Boys. And it is about a young African-American male who gets shot and killed by a police officer. He is a ghost and he meets a lot of civil rights ghosts when he dies. And I used that book a lot because I had a lot of people who were struggling with racial issues coming up. So it's understanding where that person is and what they can handle and being able to understand, which is why I read the book, because I develop questions that we talk about. But that's how you choose the book. You have to know the content of the book and you have to know what that person can get out of that book.
So I have quite a few more questions here. I might close down the questions and try to finish these off. Matt, from your experience working in schools and with school leaders, how can schools better serve and support the students who have lost hope, like Morgan described? And how can we build capacity in adults to best support these students instead of depending on exceptional individuals like the Morgans and the Matts in education?
So that's a good one. I'll start from like more of a 20,000 foot view. So like we're in the middle of a very hard year in education. And we're on the precipice of a lot of funding that will be sent to schools like Morgan and I served because of COVID relief. You're going to see they use the federal government's using the same formulas for Title I, which means like schools like the one Morgan and I served are going to get a good or project to get a good amount of money. In Detroit, for like Detroit Public Schools Community District, they're projecting like 1.2 billion with a B. So thinking through of like, how can that money go to the right things, and thinking about how can you fund schools to have more people that are trained, have experiences of doing restoration work, counseling work, social work, that are around all the time. Because I think one of the hardest things is capacity. So at schools, it's very often limited in terms of what you can do within the school day. And I think, I'll speak for myself, but I think that our team at that school was really willing to extend our days often. But there's a timeline on that type of work, of working 75 hours a week. Like that's a hard thing to manage in a lifetime. So like the amount of capacity that could come from that type of money, right? Because I think Detroit Public Schools spends 15 times the amount on their police force than they do on social workers. This could be an amazing moment to do what should be done all the time, because even that amount of funding wouldn't restore what schools used to get in the past. So I would start that, because there's not exactly a foundational financial investment into this type of work. You'll find in a lot of places where a student code of conduct will say, you can make a choice to have a restorative conference. You can also suspend them. But like now, about removing that element of choice and ramping up the training of individuals in the building would be really helpful. I think to the second part of the question, in education, I mean, for me, in the micro moments, I'm trying to find joy. That's what I'm trying with students. So like even in the harshest of times, I'm trying to find it. Oftentimes I miss, but I'm trying. And I think that was a commonality that I've seen with educators that have had breakthroughs or just are rooted in the things that I think matter for students. So in that, you're also finding out where a lot about a student, about where they find joy, where they don't, where do they feel harmed, because those might be in very different places than where you would feel harmed. I think one question I always ask my students, especially the ones that used to visit my office often, is like, where would you go to find joy if you had the choice to? And that will tell you a lot about a child. But I do think in that Grand Canyon sized gap between what our students deserve and what they get, there is a lot of work to be done on school leaders and district professionals being more rooted in creating joy for students rather than moving a dot on a graph in a direction that feels comfortable. So in that, it's kind of redefining what success in school means, which is a lot more of a long-term project. But I think through an investment of resources that we are on the precipice of receiving, it could be a very important step.
So I'm just going to start to wrap up, but I'm going to give you one quick question, Morgan, and one longer one. One plays off of what Matt was just talking about, which is, Morgan, what is the most joyful or inspiring memory you have from the school in question? And what is something you wish everyone on this call knew about the joy, talents, and brilliance you saw while you were there?
Awesome. And I will say that in the fuller outline of the play, we get into some of those. This is more like that balance of like, funny, but, kind of serious. And then we get a little bit more serious. And then we kind of end on that high note of like what Matt was talking about, the joy. And there's so many moments of joy. Like, it's just so interesting because I think that when you're in a situation where you realize, like Andre said, what's real and what ain't real, you start to focus on what really is important. And so like I remember walking into one of the teachers' rooms one time, and the students, I guess it was like free play, like they had free time to do their work, and the kids had on their headphones, and like when the kids were just moonwalking backwards, some kids were just in a corner just rocking, and they were just at peace. It's like they're doing their schoolwork, life is good, nothing's going bad, like nobody was fighting each other, like everybody was just at peace. And I just kept saying to the teacher, look at them, like they're at peace. And I don't think people really could understand like why I was finding so much joy in that moment. But it's just a lot of those little moments. It's when one of my students, like when we was in the lunchroom, just for some random reason just spinning around in his chair, and it was just making him happy. Or uh, just so many moments. When we had our final exams, and one of my students cried when she saw what her grade was on the previous exam. So a lot of joyful moments. And yeah.
And I'm going to wrap it up with this question that is burning in every audience member's mind, because I remember asking you when we were working through the script, what was the greasy substance that was on her desk?
Well, that for those who don't know, that I have a very spiritual background. And as you saw me mention that I attribute everything to Jesus Christ. So that was just blessed oil that I just used to kind of to say like, hey, peace lives here. And the goal is to not put enough for them to notice, but it got funny watching their reactions after sometimes. So I would kind of, bump it up a little a little bit. Good question.
Well, we have a couple others, but I think we need to close this out. So, do you have any closing remarks for us, Morgan? First of all, I want to tell you, as your director, what a wonderful job you did tonight. So, thank you for sharing your talents and your gifts. And I'm going to mute myself now.
Okay. Well, you all kind of like the question that you asked Matt in terms of like how to um, build that bridge between the the resources for social emotional wellness and education. Is it possible? And I had actually had that question asked to both of you. I pretty much kind of knew what both would say, but I think it was great to hear an educator say, yeah, we can make space for it, but we do have to be very strategic about it. So I will say that that's all I have to say. I thank you all. And if Matt and Marna have anything to say, the one thing I will say, and I talked to you about this, is that I created a little poster for the witch because it's a lot going on in the play that have, and this poster just has a lot of just quick talking points about different themes. So like I said, the ACE scores, which is for adverse childhood experiences, generational trauma, those things are all on that. And they're on our website to purchase for donation to kind of keep the project going. So you can go to the company that I own. I hope I'm not gonna get in trouble for this. Is this a conflict of interest? I don't know. We'll cut it out. But if you go to healbelive.com, you can go to our store and you can, purchase this poster and also, help to fundraise for this programming in, certain spaces that maybe can't just bring it just yet, the materials. But I just really want to get the word out, and I just thank you all so much for participating in this. Thank you, Diane. My love and appreciation for you would never be able to be placed in words. Thank you for pushing me. And thank you, Matt, for giving me access to these students and sharing these students with me and always pushing me ways that I don't want to be pushed as well. But I know that I'm better because of it. And thank you, Marna, for allowing me to adopt you into my life without any rhyme or reason, and just letting me say, okay, are we doing this? And you're like, okay, we're gonna do this, okay. And I just thank you all, and thank you all so much for tuning in this evening.
And thank you to all of our Theater Nova audience as well for supporting us through this pandemic, and for watching all of our Zoom plays. That is keeping hope alive for us as well. Thanks again to Marna and Matt, and most of all to you, Morgan.
Thank you. And this last thing I will say is, I don't know if they're on, is that my students, I just want to shout out my students again. Some of them were supposed to be tuning in, so I hope they did, and I hope they're proud. And I love you guys. So
goodbye, everybody. Thank you so much for staying.